Okay. David, will you let me know when I can go?
Anytime.
Oh, okay. Fabulous. All right. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to talk about this wonderful artist that I love and adore in a place that I also love and adore, Naples. And so those of you who participated last time in our conversation about Napoli Unveiled, of course, as we talked about, Napoli Unveiled is a very big order. It's a tall order. But I thought it would be nice to kind of dig a little bit deeper on some of these subjects that really deserve and merit their own conversation. And so I thought one of the most fascinating artists, and I think many of you, probably all of you who are on the chat, know who Caravaggio is. And so really looking in particular at three of his works that he completed while he was in Naples. He did others, but the three that are still there are the ones that I would really like to concentrate on. But before we get down to Naples, I just wanted to tell you, you all know that I am not an art historian. I didn't study art history as an undergraduate or in graduate school, but I came to study abroad. I was a political science major. I came to study abroad, and I was a women's studies minor and a Spanish minor and a political science major, and we were not, sort of museum people by nature. And so when I came to study abroad, it was the very first time that I was introduced really to the history of art. And I was taking a course in my program that was Renaissance art history. And we took our mid-semester, basically it was our 4-day school trip to Rome, and we were with our art history professor. And there were two classes at the time that were being offered. One was the Renaissance class that I was taking, and the other was a Renaissance and Baroque course. And when we went down to Rome, the professor was there for both of the classes, but we only had, if you were only taking the Renaissance, you only had to go to the Renaissance sites in Rome. You didn't have to, quote unquote, go with your class to the Baroque sites in Rome. Well, I asked my professor, of course, I wasn't taking the Baroque class, but I said, can I come? I really would love to see what Baroque art is all about, not really having much of a clue what that meant. And she was great, Linda Reynolds, and she said, yeah, absolutely, come along. And we walked in, our very first stop for this particular course was San Luigi dei Francesi and the Contarelli Chapel with the Calling of St. Matthew, which is what we're looking at right now. And I, again, here I am, I'm the only exposure that I really have to history of art at this point in my life was Renaissance. So it was all perfect, harmonious, balanced, everyone looking idealized and lovely and gorgeous all the time and photoshopped everything. And then all of a sudden, in this chapel, my professor fed the little light box. All churches in Rome are free, unlike here in Florence, but you do have to feed the meter. You feed the little light meter. And all of a sudden, the chapel lights up, and this is in front of us. And I remember, it's one of those moments that I distinctly remember just in awe, standing there, being with this work of art and just luxuriating, quite frankly, in the fact that I wasn't taking this class, so I didn't have to ask if it was going to be on the test. I could just enjoy listening to my professor talk about it. And it was the first time I ever heard the term chiaroscuro, which I thought was just beautiful. I loved this word. I had no idea what this term meant, but she explained that it's chiaro, light, and scuro, dark. But that we use actually, in terminology for all eras of the history of art. But Caravaggio takes that play, it's that play of light and shadow, and he takes it to a whole nother level, as you can see here. So that extreme light source that's coming in and lighting up this dramatic, this really alive kind of composition where you have Christ coming in. It's, as I said, called the Calling of St. Matthew, pointing to, can you all see St. Matthew? He's the one pointing to himself. He is here. Let me put my laser pointer on. He's here. with this sort of jaunty beret and this long beard, and he's sitting at a counting table because we think we know that Matthew was a tax collector prior to becoming an apostle, and surrounded by all of these other figures. This guy doesn't even know what's going on. He doesn't even see the Christ in the room. He's still counting. Someone else here is looking down, right, clutching his glasses, really intent, and there's Matthew going, me? You want me, right? This kind of doubtful or incredulous look that he has on his face, and then this wonderful kind of motion of Christ's hand as he points towards his chosen one, probably St. Peter here on the side. And they're all dressed not in the time of Christ clothes, but in these 17th century, in the 17th century garb. And so the light, the drama, the action, all of this, I was hooked forever and ever. This is also in the same chapel. This is St. Matthew who's writing his gospel, and the angel, right? Matthew is always represented by an angel, and the angel is up here, and I love this, how he's swooping down, and he's kind of, you can see he's like, and now you should write this, and he's giving his bullet points of what Matthew should be writing. And I learned in this moment with my art history professor that this was the second version, because the first version, Caravaggio, had actually painted with Matthew's feet facing the other way, facing towards the viewer. That would have been right over the altar, right where the host is being consecrated. The priest, consecrates the host over Matthew's dirty feet that are facing out that way. And very likely, right, it just didn't garner a whole lot of favor in the family and the church that it was in because of that. So here I am, just like I said, luxuriating in the paintings, in the terminology, in this man's life that is so dramatic, and it's so rich in all of these stories. And so we leave San Luigi dei Francesi and we go to the Borghese Gallery, and I learn even more about Caravaggio. I learned that Caravaggio is not actually a name, it's the name of a place, and he was called Michelangelo Merisi. Now, when you're born in 1571 and you're called Michelangelo and you're good at painting, you're probably going to have to get a little bit of a nickname. Michelangelo had died in 1564, but he kind of had taken on ownership of that name. And so as a nickname, when Michelangelo Merisi leaves his birthplace, so Caravaggio is a place near Milan. It's actually quite near Bergamo, which unfortunately probably many of you have now heard of. If you hadn't, it was the epicenter of the coronavirus emergency here in Italy. And he's from this tiny town called Caravaggio, and he's born he's not totally destitute, but he's not from a wealthy family. His father died when he was young, and his mother died when he was a teenager. And they had a sort of protection from two different families there in the town. One is called the Sforza family, which many of you have probably heard of, and very important, powerful ruling family of Milan. And then the Colonna family, which was an incredibly important Roman family. And he leaves his birthplace, he leaves Caravaggio, and he goes to Rome. And he's quite young, he's in his early 20s, and he had never really received an education. And this is a great painting here to be able to talk about. It's called Boy with a Basket of Fruit for obvious reasons. But to be able to understand that when he gets down to Rome, because he hadn't had workshop training, he had probably studied with someone, his eyes were wide open, and he was exposed to a tremendous amount of Northern Italian art. He didn't have the standard education, let's say. So when he gets down to Rome, he realizes, and everybody else realizes, he's got some catching up to do. And so he doesn't immediately go into a workshop, and he never really will, actually. He starts getting hired as a kind of day laborer to come in and do fruits and flowers primarily. And he'll remark often on how he thinks that a piece of fruit is just as important as the human figure. And he's just as interested in being able to render that piece of fruit as he is in rendering the human figure. He's also really interested in the life cycle of fruits and leaves and these sorts of things. So oftentimes you'll see things that are sort of decaying, that are rotting a little bit. And Caravaggio in Rome at this time, in the late, early, and all through the 1590s, he is a complete revolutionary when it comes to his painting, not his style, also his style, but his technique. He doesn't do drawings. We don't have any drawings, no drawings survive by Caravaggio. And in fact, one of the easiest ways to determine whether or not the Caravaggio in the attic, that someone's nonna found in their attic and wants to sell at Christie's for who knows how many millions, the best way to determine immediately if it's a Caravaggio is to x-ray it and see if there's an underdrawing. Because if there is, it means it's not by Caravaggio. He does not do underdrawings. He doesn't participate in that type of study. And this really irritated, it's a bigger deal than it seems, because it irritated the other artists who had spent, it had been 200 years. Think about Lorenzo Ghiberti at the beginning of the 1400s, who was trying so hard to bring the status of a painter, for example, or a sculptor up to the status of a poet or the status of a philosopher. And here, the whole notion behind why painting should be brought up or sculpture should be brought up to that level was because they argued, these artists, that the visual arts were an intellectual pursuit, because you were doing the drawings, you were doing the studies, then you were studying those, you were creating and crafting out of those studies the ideal painting or the ideal figure, whatever it happened to be. And so all of a sudden, if you're coming in, they said, anybody can do what you're doing, Caravaggio. Anybody can sit down, which I love this. Anybody cannot do this. But they said anybody can sit down and paint what's in front of them. That doesn't take any skill, right? There's nothing special about that. And they started to get, like I said, they started to get bothered by this. And they were always really nervous that he would have a school and a following. And of course, he doesn't ever have a school. He has lots of followers. But he immediately, kind of rubs the other artists in Rome the wrong way because of this. And at the same time, he was so revolutionary in his style in this sort of use of chiaroscuro and the use of lighting in this kind of realism. So we're taking it out of the naturalism, where again, you're kind of idealizing these figures, into a more quote unquote realistic image of reality. And this is also at the Borghese. So here I am, I'm in this, day of wandering around with the Baroque art history class. And we have the boy with the basket of fruit. We have who's called the sick Bacchus. And we learn that Caravaggio, because he doesn't have a whole lot of money, he used himself quite often as a model. Why not use your own reflection, and you're able to save money on models? But he was also using people from the streets and people from the markets, people from the common areas. Again, nobody's doing this. You were trying to always, in painting, elevate, right, to the point that you were making it this kind of noble pursuit. And Caravaggio comes in and just kind of shatters all of these notions. Now, Caravaggio was wild, and he was different. He was strange. He immediately, when he would sell any type of painting, as soon as he got to Rome, he would make some money, and he would literally spend the next 2 or 3 weeks after payday on a bender. He would go and just get completely drunk, and he would party, and he would fight, and he would sometimes get really sick and end up in the hospital, or he would get in a fight and get arrested and go to jail for a little while. And in fact, this Bacchus is probably following a stint in the hospital. where he got out and realized, oh God, I just, spent all that time in the hospital. I spent all my money on my bender. I need some money. And so do this render, take myself and make myself into this Bacchus. But this is important because it's not just kind of, I think, anyway, I don't think it's secondary. Caravaggio spends his entire life, this is going to be a theme with him, that he spends his entire life essentially passing through these periods of intense light and darkness. And you can't help but think that that is coming out in his paintings. It's hard. It's like with novels, you don't want to constantly be putting the author in as protagonist or seeing everything as autobiographical. I will tell you that like 80% of what we know about Caravaggio comes from police reports. And we know a lot about Caravaggio. So he was on the radar, let's put it that way, of the law enforcers of the time. But he would follow these periods of darkness, of fighting, of drunkenness, of gambling, losing his money, with intense periods of light. And what do I mean by that? It was almost like he would have it was like a penitence moment, I don't want to say a conversion at all because I don't want to bring it to that level, but he would express the fact that he really truly felt that he was a noble soul, that he had a noble heart. And so he wasn't just going to behave himself now, he was going to be the best person that anyone had ever seen. He was going to be noble. He was going to shine his noble heart. And inevitably that would not happen. He would pass, through that period of acting in that way, and then he would fall again, and then he would come back up. And so this story of Caravaggio, I think, it's like St. Peter. St. Peter, I'm not calling Caravaggio a saint by any means, but I am saying that St. Peter to me is the most relatable of all of the apostles because he was always messing up. I can't relate to someone who's just always doing everything perfectly and just has absolute faith and yes, absolutely no questioning. Peter's like, just constantly messing up and constantly being forgiven. And Caravaggio here is doing the same thing where he's trying so hard, and you get that sense, and he's so sought after. He really is so tremendously sought after and very, very famous during this time period. But then he'll always kind of follow it up with this dip down and this fall. So we're going to see one of those moments in Naples today. This is just another painting that's in the Borghese that next to the Misericordia angels, these might be my favorite Caravaggio figures ever, because Caravaggio was constantly painting these works of art. Now we're in Counter-Reformation Italy at this point, so there are lots of rules, doctrinal rules, even about how you can represent certain figures. And in this case, you have the Virgin Mary here, and her mother, St. Anne, with the baby Jesus, a little too old to be quite that nude, I think. The Virgin Mary, who is, showing quite a bit of her physique off here, looking quite coquettish as she's leaning over, and her foot is actually stepping on the serpent, which was probably the reason it was actually denied, again for doctrinal reasons. And then this really ancient-looking St. Anne. So no Botoxing, no photoshopping, no nothing. And these figures were just too much. They were too human. They were too real. And altarpieces like this end up getting carried out of the churches and the chapels for which they were made because they proved to be too controversial. So I was immediately hooked. Caravaggio, I think, is that kind of artist. I think he's an artist for our time. We can relate to this. We can relate to these kind of dramatic tools that he's using, this kind of style, we can relate to the ups and downs, and we can relate to these kinds of stories again, much more so than we can to those artists that seem to just be sort of touched by divine grace or whatever, and we don't see how it's actually the creative process and how it's being made, let's say. And so I find him appealing, and I think this is probably a lot of you do as well. But Caravaggio, the St. Matthew that I showed you at the beginning, that was his first monumental. It's right at the turn of the century in the 1600s. In 1606, Caravaggio has his lowest, well, one of his lowest moment to date, let's put it that way, where he actually kills, he says by accident, a rival called Ranuccio Tomazzini. And Tomasi, he kills him by accident. And he says he kills him by accident. And it was over the outcome of like a tennis match. So it was kind of a silly thing, but we don't know all the details clearly about this, but he goes on the run. He hides out. He has a lot of extraordinarily powerful friends in Rome, and he he thinks it was an accident. I'm sure I'm going to get amnesty. I'm just going to lay low for a couple of days, get in touch, through my people with my cardinal connections, and see if I can't get this expunged, get this taken care of. But it was one step too far. It was one step too far. They were constantly bailing him out, and they just couldn't do it. His powerful patrons couldn't do it for him. And so he leaves. He makes the decision to leave the papal states, because remember, this is not just Rome the way that we think about it, or the Vatican. The control of the Pope, really the kingdom of the Pope, was almost all of central Italy at this point. And so he has to leave that entire area. He has to leave that entire part of the country. And so he goes south. He goes to Naples. Two reasons. Number one, it's close. And number two, he has protection there. That family that I mentioned at the beginning, the Colonna family, they are Roman. They have branches all over the country. This is how he was protected by them, even when he was up in his hometown and in his home region of Lombardia. But they have very powerful connections in Naples as well. And so he goes to Naples in 1606. So this is September 1606, and he gets to Naples. Now, those of you who participated in the conversation on Naples, or those of you who know a little bit of Neapolitan history, in the beginning of the 1600s, the Spanish had just taken control of, or not just, they had taken control many decades earlier from the French. Naples was a very hotly contested, it was the most incredible cultural center, intellectual center, but it's also extraordinarily rich because of its position down on the coast. And so the Spanish had taken over. At the beginning of the 1600s, the Holy Roman Emperor was Philip III, so he's ruling from Madrid, and everything Naples and south is, pretty much everything is under control of the Spanish at this point. So it's the Kingdom of Naples being ruled by the Spanish royal family. Their viceroy was in Naples proper. And it was a period of incredible contrast. I know you're shocked because Naples is contrast. But at this junction in its history, it was, on the one hand, very, very wealthy, and it was receiving a tremendous amount of it was the scene of a lot of patronage because you have the royal family there. So you have lots of opportunity for these nobles. They're building their palazzi. You're never going to get the monumental palazzi that you get in Rome or Venice, for example, or Florence. There's just not room. Naples was already really, really tightly packed. But you have palazzi that are being built. You have the nobles who are looking for artists, artisans to be able to commission things for their homes, for their chapels, so on and so forth. On the other hand, and you have a lot of them too moving into the city because the viceroy had created a system that was really beneficial, let's say, to the nobles. They also wanted to be at court. It was more fun to be closer to the power. And so you have them all moving in. But he also created a system where he was encouraging a lot of those artisans to come and move in to the center. He was offering, X number of years of tax-free living. There were lots of opportunities for patronage. And so at the same time that you have a lot of opportunity, you also have the second most populated city in Europe at the time. It was 300,000 people. It's second only to Paris. It is by far the largest. Rome had 100,000, just to give you an idea of the difference. And the size of Naples, those of you who have been to Naples and been to Rome, you know Rome is much larger, the city itself. And so people are really packed in. And so you have a lower class that is suffering quite badly. Also not only because of the living conditions, so these are the years of the Bassi that we talked about in our other conversation, that are those one room that still exists today. Those one room casa bodegas where you would have your house and your work in one window. That's it, street level. Okay. And so you've got everybody sort of packed in. You can imagine the illnesses, the plague, when the plague rips through, kills tens of thousands. And you have the viceroy and his nobles who were quite committed to making sure that the Neapolitan people were paying Madrid what they thought they deserved. And so at the expense of the Neapolitan people, Madrid and the royals were making quite a bit of money. And so this is when Caravaggio goes down. I'm just showing you a couple of images here. This is the Certosa in Naples. This is the city that he goes into, right? So as I said, on the one hand, you've got an extraordinary amount of opportunities. On the other, you've got social revolts that are taking place because the famines and variety of social issues in Naples. You also have a Spanish ruling entity that is extraordinarily connected to the church. And so the church is literally dictating everything. So it has the artists a little bit in its grip. And so everything had to comply with a lot of the rules that had come out of the Council of Trent in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s in the century prior. And so you have this really, really powerful church as well. But at the same time, so here's our contrast, at the same time that you have this really powerful church and patrons within the church, you also have the presence in the 1600s, 15 and 1600s, late 15 and 1600s, of Giordano Bruno and Tommaso Campanella, who are the two philosophers really that are motivating, that are beginning the pushback and really what will be the revolt against the Roman Inquisition coming into town. So on the one hand, you've got the nobles, as we talked about, who are living high and living large and doing their thing. You have the lower classes who are being mistreated, feel they're being mistreated, that are revolting constantly. So you've got those clashes. You've got the church that is super powerful, but then at the same time, you have these revolutionaries that are, Campanella's doing all this from prison. It's not like they're walking around town doing this. But my point is, Naples is the perfect place for Caravaggio. So here he is with his mixed style that comes from his early training in, or at least experience, influences of his home up in the north, that kind of realism and naturalism, and then the Roman kind of mannerism that had really taken hold in the latter part of the 1500s. So here he is with his own crazy mix. He comes into Naples with its own crazy mix. This is an image of one of the plagues later on in the 17th century, but just again, to give you an idea, just to contrast it, right? Where you've got the Certosa, you've got this beautiful, very thriving city. And then you've got this situation. And let's be honest, those of you who know Naples, that's still the situation. Naples is still this city of contrast. So it's easy for us to be able to really quickly imagine what kind of city Caravaggio actually found when he got there. This is one of the Bassi, you can see here with the family sitting outside, and then this wonderful street art that is on created on the facade of one of these houses. Here's some more wonderful street art, and then here you have this incredible, just jaw-dropping, where you just think beauty, beauty, beauty. And so here again, then you turn the corner and that's where you are, which I actually find this quite beautiful. But my point is this kind of contrast. That's the town, that's the city, I shouldn't call it town, that's the city that Caravaggio shows up in 1606. And the very first commission that he gets is what is called the Piemonte, the Misericordia, the Piemonte. And this was a confraternity, so a sort of lay association that was created in those years. It was actually created right in the very year that Caravaggio got to Naples. And it was founded by 7 nobles of Neapolitan families. And it really was to respond to the needs of the Neapolitans, of the lower classes, but not only. They actually had 10, it was an organization to help the poor. They had 10 different categories of the poor. I mean, I just think this is amazing. So total chaos outside, and then it's like so organized, everything's so completely put together. 10 categories of poor. So the first 6 were nobles. And then, kind of went down the line. These were very common, these types of confraternities. I'm a huge fan of confraternities. I love the history of confraternities in Italy. It was a way, of course, for people who are participating in it, this is a heavily Christian society, to be able to gain salvation. But there's, in these very capitalistic societies, there very much was this attention to the social ills of the time. And so here you're looking at the outer portion of the Piemonte. And one of the founding members is a connection of the Colonna family, so Caravaggio's protectors in Naples. So immediately, and like I said, Caravaggio is very well known. I mean, everybody knows him, and you kind of know what you're going to get if you commission him for something. So it wasn't like this was a completely unknown entity, not at all. And so when they call in Caravaggio for the 7 acts of mercy, they actually asked him initially to do when you go into the chapel, there are 7 altars inside of the chapel. And they'd initially asked him to do each of the 7, so 1 act of mercy per altar. And he said, I'm going to put them all together. And they said, that's going to be busy. There's a lot going on in the 7 acts of mercy. Plus, you have to add in the Virgin of the Misericordia, the Blessed Virgin of the Misericordia, the baby Jesus. That's a lot. Said, I think I can handle it. And so this is what comes out of it. So this is the central altar in this room. I'll show you at the end of after I talk about the painting, I'll show you the entire room so you can see it. It's huge. It's massive, this canvas. And he does exactly what he said he was going to do. He has the Virgin here, who is coming in on these, flying in, being supported by these amazing swirling angels. And then we have the 7 acts of mercy that are actually taking place. So you can see this really typical Caravaggesque the style of Caravaggio with this light source here, the casting of the shadows, right? You can see how he's taking the light, he's piercing, he's penetrating certain parts of it. Not the typical only black background, dark background, where everything gets pushed so far up to the front of the picture plane, although you of course do have this figure here. So let's look at this a little more in detail. You can see more up close. So I'll take you through and I'll show you, but I think this image rather nicely shows how it's busy, but it doesn't feel overwhelming, at least to my eye, to be able to look at this. But let's take us through. So the first act of mercy is feeding the hungry and visiting prisoners. And so you have, this is a representation of what's called Roman charity. And this is a story that was told by a Roman historian, an ancient Roman historian, about a woman called Pero and her father, Simon, who had been, he was known as a very good man, and he was unjustly accused, and he was put into prison, and he was ordered to be put to death by starvation. And so the story goes that this historian tells us that she went and she breastfed her father. Now, straight up, I can see a couple of your faces, and that's pretty much the reaction that everybody has. But the ancient Romans, and even up until this point, they saw it as a deed of the utmost, the sort of most noble act that could be performed. And so it was very traditional, let's say, to represent this. It kind of gives us the shivers. But so you have here again the concentration, let's say, of that light on certain parts of faces, bodies, clothing, right? And one thing that you're going to notice, of course, is that they're all dressed not in ancient garb, but instead in 17th century clothes. And so if we have feeding the hungry, so he's gotten two, right? He's killed two birds with one stone here, because he's done feeding the hungry and visiting prisoners. The next one that you have is burial of the dead. So this is our third act of mercy, corporal acts of mercy. Burial of the dead. How would you know that this is burial of the dead? You have to be very, very attentive, because all we see actually of the deceased are his feet. That's all you get. So if I go back here, right, this is where we are. So we've got Pero and Simon here. And then you've got the feet, you've got the undertaker, right, who's kind of holding right here, and then this torch up top, lighting this, but the majority of the body is already inside. So it's this partial view, but it's another one that we can kind of check off of our list. Then you come to, let me just show you guys, this is the front, the center rather left. So it's this figure who is on the ground, okay? And then up top, I don't know how well you can make this out, but up at the top, you see these gloves. So anytime you've got gloves, that is the number one symbol, sign of nobility. So automatically, you know that we're dealing with someone important. He has on this feathered cap. He has on can you see the cuffs here now that I'm calling your attention to it? You've got gloves, you've got this amazing silk garb. And you have the figure himself who is actually dividing his cloak to be able to give down. Can you see how the cloak follows the laser down? Can you see how it goes down? And the nude man, the naked man, has taken it, and he will then cloak himself in it. So this is Saint Martin. Saint Martin, who is a noble. The story goes that he was the son of a Roman general, and was, of course, supposed to take over from his father. And one day he's riding through the countryside, and he has on all of his noble garb, and a beggar comes to him, and it's cold out, and he doesn't have the appropriate clothing. And so St. Martin takes his cloak and he cuts it in half, and he gives half of it to this man in need. That very night, Martin goes back to his sumptuous rooms. he falls asleep and he's visited by none other than the man who he had given half of his cloak to, who comes in, you know, with all this wonderful light behind him. And what St. Martin realizes is that it was Christ that he had given his half of his cloak to. Remember, he's supposed to take over for his father, who was a great general, and he himself was a soldier already. And he went to his commanding officer and he said, after this dream, you know, gets up the next morning and said, I can't fight. I can't be a part of the army. And he becomes the first conscientious objector in at least Western history, and goes on, of course, to become a bishop and then a saint. And so here, this again, it would have been immediately recognizable because this is a story that everyone knew. Plus, it's a noble. It makes sense to have this noble St. Martin in this noble confraternity. So you've got Martin there. I just want to point out, it's so hard to see this, even when you're there in the Piemonte, when you're in the chapel, but there's a sick man who's also down here on the ground. You can see one of his feet right there. So your eye goes immediately to this. But so this is tending to the sick and clothing the poor, clothing the naked. Then you look up. So again, I'll just go back so we can see who it is that we're talking about. So here's Martin, right here. There's the sick figure and the poor man on the ground here. Up above, just where the feather ends, you can see this face right here. It's very gaunt, bearded face, and then a kind of very not gaunt, well-fed man across from him. And those are St. James. You can see the shell up on his hat. And so James is the Santiago, the Camino de Santiago. He is the patron of pilgrims. And so anytime you see that shell, whether it's on the cloak or on the hat, you know that he's a pilgrim and he's being shown lodging by the man who obviously has plenty to eat and has somewhere to stay and all this. So one of the other corporal acts of mercy is giving lodging, giving assistance to pilgrims. So there we are. We have one more to go. So this is, if we go back again, and we go, so he's here. This is the detail that I'm showing you right here. This figure who is drinking out of a jawbone. This is a donkey's jawbone here. So here's the shell of St. James. And then here you can see the liquid that's coming out. So you can see water. This is Samson. And this is actually a really unique, we don't have any precedents for this, representation of giving water to the thirsty, which is our last corporal act of mercy that's being shown here. There's 7 of them. And Samson, what we all know Samson because of that hair, right? That gave him all of his strength. But Samson also was said to have defeated an entire army on his own using only the jaw of the donkey. And after he does this, he's tired and he's thirsty and he's kind of like slain the enemy army and he's wandering around and he, you know, says to God, I did all of this. I did all of this on my own with just this jawbone and I'm thirsty and there's no water around. And so God slakes the rock, you know, all of a sudden water comes out of the rock. So he doesn't drink it out of the jawbone, but that's what Caravaggio is showing us, is that this is Samson, puts the jawbone in there and then shows. Now, he's the only one, Samson's the only one in this painting that's not performing an act of mercy. Everyone else is performing burial of the dead, feeding the hungry, visiting, you know, clothing the poor, all of that. But this is Samson receiving mercy straight from God. So this act of mercy that comes straight from God. And then my absolute favorite part, as I've already told you, these amazing swirling angels that are like tumbling all around, supporting the Virgin and Child here. And so the Virgin of the Misericordia. But the angels themselves who take on this kind of, look at that, the arm here lit up and then that forceful kind of motion. with this right hand of coming in, bringing the grace down to the people, giving them the impetus, giving them the grace to be able to perform those acts of mercy. So the acts of mercy are performed by the confraternity, by humans, right? In this case, this Neapolitan confraternity, thanks to the grace of God coming through these angels, so these amazing celestial beings that are coming in and giving that divine grace to everyone to be able to perform that. So here's the altarpiece. This is the chapel. So here's the altarpiece. And then each of the other ones have an altarpiece there. No one ever really looks at the other ones because the Caravaggio is so terribly spectacular. But this is a place that you can visit. You can, I don't remember how much it costs, whatever it is, it's worth it. It's like €5 or something. And you can go in and you can actually also visit the rooms of the confraternity that are upstairs. I should tell you, the confraternity still exists. The Piemonte still exists. What they do is they still meet on a weekly basis, but instead of directly, let's say, ministering to the poor, and especially for healthcare matters, they partner with nonprofits and other associations to be able to work through them. So they don't do a lot of direct assistance, but they do it through these other channels there in Naples. So it's a really beautiful part of the Neapolitan story. The altarpiece was very well received, as you can imagine. I should tell you that Caravaggio does 5 or 6 paintings during his really short time. He's only in Naples for like 9 months max. He's gone by July of the next year. Only 3 of them remain. He'll come back to Naples, and I'll tell you about that painting in just one second. But these are the only 2 that remain from his first trip into the city, and his first sojourn, I guess I should say, to inside of Naples. And this is held now at the Capo di Monte, so the museum, incredible museum painting gallery that's up on one of the hills in the city of Naples. But it was originally, excuse me, done for the Church of San Domenico. I found this picture and I was like, I've never seen the piazza that empty. I have no idea. This must be like August 15th or something at 6 in the morning, because I have never seen Piazza San Domenico empty like this. But the church is right here. It's kind of a funky, facade, and has actually a couple of different facades, a couple of different entrances. This is the interior, just to give you a sense. So from the outside, you go in, and it's this incredible space. And this was done for a chapel now that's called Zia Andrea. But originally, this was where Caravaggio's flagellation was supposed to go, and it was commissioned by one of the members of the confraternity of the Misericordia of the Piemonte. So clearly his work was appreciated, and he was commissioned to execute this flagellation. Let me just go back here and see this. So this is the moment that Christ he's entered into Jerusalem. He has been arrested. The Last Supper has happened, the betrayal of Judas, he's been arrested, and he's tortured. So flagellation meaning, of course, the whipping of Christ. He's already got his crown of thorns on. So this is the Passion of Christ. So it's one of the most heartbreaking, one of the most violent, one of the most moving images that come out of the New Testament. And Caravaggio is clearly being inspired. It was a fairly popular theme, let's say. He's being inspired here by Sebastiano del Piombo in a church in Rome called San Pietro Montorio, that he clearly has taken the composition, you can see. But what Caravaggio has done, instead of this wonderful kind of rotunda, the kind of tribune that they're in, very classical architecture, lots of space, right, movement and all this, but a kind of grace and a kind of layout that gives us the sense of pauses between each of the figures. Here instead, Caravaggio does this typical collapsing down. So just like we saw with the 7 acts of mercy. Here too, he's collapsing the entire thing down into one much smaller space and creating that sense of the flagellation right in the very center of the entire scene. So I'll take you through here again and show you some of these details. I hope you can make this out. So this is the figure that's at the very front, where you have him. Now again, look at the use of light, how he's rendering this to give us the action at its height. This is what the Baroque was all about. It was like the pause button on the DVD player on our, we don't have DVD players anymore. The pause button on Netflix, you know, when you're right at that key moment. That's what the Baroque, that's what they valued. That's the moment that they always wanted to get to. So here you've got, look at this figure down on the lower left, who is, you can see how he's pulling, he's tying his, the bundle of sticks together, his lash together with this rope, and you can see how he's grasping the sticks to keep them, the branches, to keep them together, to form his lash, to form his whip, essentially. Down here, he's leaned down, he's still looking up though, right? He can't take his eyes off of the action entirely. So he's working on this and he's putting his physical energy, but he's looking up into all of this action because it is, as I said, it is the height of the drama, the height of the action. This is the figure that's on the left-hand side as we're looking at this. So one of his torturers who has him by the hair. Okay, he's grabbing him by the hair to steady him because his last is already made, his lash rather, is already made. You can see this here. He's grabbing his hair to steady his target, right? So that he can really get in there and create that pain and that blow there. And you can see the sort of demonic look in his eyes, the furrowed brow. So there's nothing idealized here. There's nothing here that, you know, has the cheesecloth over it and is taking some of the bitterness and the pain out of this. It's all there right up in front of your face. The man on the, so he's on the left, this is on the right hand side. This torturer is trying to tie Christ's hands together. So all of this is going on. By the way, this is a 10-foot tall canvas. It is huge. It is massive. It is so imposing. When you go into this room, it's at the end of a room in the Museum of Capodimonte. And it is, I'm sure, as powerful now as it was in its original context. So massive, so big, so centered on the passion and so centered on the suffering of Christ. I go back to this one because not only is he tying his hands or trying to grip his hands as tightly as possible, he also is pushing down. Can you see this is his leg that's pushing on Christ's leg, onto Christ's right leg. So trying to, you know, sort of subdue him even further so that Christ then kind of bends in that way. But then you have this image of Christ that is, he's like a moon. He's the moon against the dark sky, right? You have this Christ that is just lit up absolutely by this light source, but also, I would say, from within, his head is tilted towards us. So it's coming towards, so we're even more in contact with his suffering. And I mean, I have to say, I was thinking about this today, and I was looking through it, and I was looking at all the different pieces, and I just, like I said at the beginning, you know, the state of the world and all of this, and sometimes I think, do I want to go there? Do I want to talk about this? Do I want to show this? And I have been doing a lot of thinking on my own about suffering and about other people's suffering, not my own suffering necessarily, but other people's suffering, and how I don't have a television. So I always say, you know, we don't watch the news, and I'll read it. But if I said this even the other day about something, a car crash. I said, oh, I saw the headline, but I saw there were children involved, so I didn't read it. I can't read about children being killed in a car crash. I just went past it. And I thought about it over the last couple of days, and I thought, I'm also reading a couple of things right now in that vein, and the more that we turn away from it, the more we say, I can't deal with it, I can't, you push it away, we're not part of it, and we separate ourselves from all of that pain and all that suffering. And the reality is that we can't do that, right? That we're all connected and we're all one. And so finding that ability to be able to witness the suffering of others, take it to the point that you do realize that it affects all of us. And I was telling Giacomo this story as we were walking. My poor child, again, we don't have TV, so he just gets to hear about this stuff all the time. But we were out on our little walk today, and I said, can I just go through my Caravaggio talk? He's like, yeah, of course. So I'm telling him, and we're not looking at this. I'm just explaining it to him. And I said, the thing about it is, G, is that the figures aren't, they're supposed to be Roman soldiers, but they're not dressed like Roman soldiers. And I said, they're dressed, can you imagine? I said, can you imagine? They're dressed like us. Like, imagine people just on the street that were doing this to Christ, that were whipping Christ, and you could see, you know, the blood, or torturing someone. And then I started, you know, my mind started going in all these different places, but he kind of got quiet, and he said, well, I think it was smart of him to put them in those clothes, because then that way the people who weren't giving the bread and who were taxing the poor, he said that way they could look at it and they could realize they were doing that. They were doing wrong to the people by having them live in this kind of scene or scenario or whatever. And I said, yeah, you just pretty much nailed it. Wouldn't have even thought of that. Wouldn't have even connected those two things. Of course, that's what he's doing. Not maybe, you know, to the nobles themselves, but of course, that's what Caravaggio is doing by putting the 7 acts of mercy on a crowded Neapolitan street alleyway, by giving us Christ torturers in the contemporary garb. You're not able to, at that point, put a barrier in between yourself and, in the 7 acts of mercy, the case of grace and mercy and performing that. And in this case, the act of torture and of pain and of mistreatment and of the suffering of Christ. So that kind of demolishing of the barriers that Caravaggio is giving us, not just by pushing everything up so it's all in your face, you cannot ignore it, but also rendering the figures and styling them in such a way that they speak directly to you. There is no enigma, there's no kind of puzzle going on here in terms of what is being expressed. Here, this image of Christ's beautiful body here. Caravaggio leaves. He leaves Naples. We're not really sure why, but he leaves Naples after this period of very popular, he was a very popular painter. He'd made a lot of money, as I mentioned, and he leaves and he actually goes to Malta and he becomes a Knight of Malta. So when I tell you the man has extremes, he goes from, like, you know, bar fights to being a Knight of Malta. So this is a Catholic military organization. He goes down, he becomes a Knight of Malta. What does he do? He gets into a fight with another Knight of Malta. I mean, it's più forte di lui. You just can't do anything else. You are not allowed to fight with other Knights of Malta, especially when you're Caravaggio, you've just joined, you already have a bit of a reputation. So what does he do? Like any good Baroque story here, he goes to jail and he escapes. He escapes from jail and he runs away again. So here he is again on the run. He goes first to Sicily and then he comes back to Naples. And this, I just have this image here. This is the little alleyway that leads down into this osteria, the Locanda del Ceriglio, that has this sign outside that talks about how it was this place that had a kind of crazy past, and it was a seedy, you know, tavern of ill repute. And Caravaggio beelines it. He gets back to Naples as he's on the run, and he beelines it for this tavern he leaves. He obviously felt safe enough, you know, maybe because he knew the city or he thought they would still protect him. He leaves the tavern and 4 men come and accost him and beat him very, very badly, slashed his face in a variety of places. It probably was the henchman of the Knight of Malta who had been injured. But I love this. Do you guys see this? Because you're kind of covered up on my screen, but can you see the translation of the Italian down below? It says, he got out alive, but deeply scarred on his face and, does it say soul or spirit? I don't know, I can't tell. But at any rate, because it's spirito, so his soul, deeply scarred on his face and soul. I love them. That they would write that. Instead of just saying he got physically injured, his soul was also injured. Caravaggio, here again, typical, leaves the seedy tavern after being slashed on his face and soul, and he goes to recover in this place, which is a property of the Colonna family. This is in Chiaia, or San Ferdinando, near Via di Chiaia in Naples. Belongs to, it's called Palazzo Cellamare. And he goes and he recovers. I just want to show you the interior. So from seedy tavern to the lap of luxury, he goes and he recovers. And this is literally the one time in Caravaggio's life that we have the archives go totally silent on him. So he was recovering, he was recuperating. He probably was unwell anyway at this point. But he recovers, he receives this kind of protection, and then he gets a commission for a Saint Ursula. So this was commissioned by a Genovese, a Genoese noble called Marcantonio Doria, and he has a stepdaughter called Ursula, and he commissions this canvas from Caravaggio. And Caravaggio completes it. It's his last known painting. And he completes it in Naples, but he sends it. He was probably in a hurry to get out of Naples because it was 1609, and he had gotten word that he might be the recipient of a papal pardon. And so he's going to take off to go back to Rome. Unfortunately, it does not work out that way. He dies on his way back to Rome. But he sends this canvas to the patron, to the person who commissioned it in Genova when it was still wet. So you have a situation here where the canvas itself, those of you who have seen it in Naples, you know it's not in great shape. It underwent a beautiful restoration in 2004 that a lot came out. I'll show you one of the more interesting things. And it also had been painted over. It had been really a lot of interventions had been made on this painting over the centuries. And so, but you can already tell, right, that the light is different. This is not the same light. It's a much more kind of diffused light that we're getting. But Saint Ursula, the story of Saint Ursula is, here again, this is another really traditional subject matter. The story is that Saint Ursula is a princess, an English princess, and she goes down to Rome. She makes a pilgrimage to Rome with her 11,000 virgin friends, all women. And on the way back from Rome, going back up to England, she is met in Cologne by a general of the Hun army who would like to marry her. She says, absolutely not. I'm a virgin and I've got my virgin tribe with me and it's not going to happen. And so he kills her. Saint Ursula, though, anytime you see a Saint Ursula scene, almost anytime, especially up until this point, it's a crowd scene. Because it's 11,000 virgins. That's usually what it's called, Saint Ursula and the 11,000 martyrs or the 11,000 virgins. So it's usually a crowd scene. You've usually got tons of people. What does Caravaggio do? Again, collapses it all down, distills this entire dramatic moment into one scene. It's almost kind of claustrophobic in there. I mean, look at the general who's killing her. It's almost like he doesn't have enough room there to fire off the arrow. It's very tight spaces. And then look, she's already been pierced and she's looking down. She's like contemplating sweetly, almost confused, like contemplating the blood spurting out of her chest. But as far as Caravaggio goes, this is kind of toned down. in terms of the action. You have a maidservant, you have another soldier here who's ready to catch her when she falls. But most interesting, you have this face right here. You've got a face that looks like it's coming out of the back of her neck. He has no body. We only have his face. And most historians agree that this is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. Incredibly provato, as we say in Italian. You can tell that he's not well, remembering that he's probably still recovering. What it means, again, we don't want to go too deep into, I think, wanting to make every single thing autobiographical, but I think it's kind of enticing that he has put his face almost attached to the body of this martyr, kind of saying, I've been attacked as well. A little bit of mirroring or let's say identification maybe with his subject. I don't know. I mentioned something came out of the restoration in 2004. Look at this hand that's not attached to a body. It's not attached to the maidservant right here. That's coming out almost wanting to stop the arrow from going in. And so this as I mentioned, came out in the restoration. So all of these things kind of come together. It was sent wet. So he even talks about, Doria talks about leaving it out to dry. As soon as he got it, he unrolled it, it was rolled up, leaving it out to dry. As I said, centuries of people really coming in and intervening and painting over it. And just conservation, but the restoration is amazing. And this is held still in Naples. This is a palazzo on Via Toledo, so on the high street in Naples, and you can see how absolutely lovely this is. There's about 120 other works of art inside of this. So this is one of these really great little hidden secrets of Naples, I feel like. Walking by, I mean, there's a big giant poster that says Caravaggio inside, but other than that, if you're not kind of seeking this one out, I think it's easy to miss, but it's really, really rewarding when you are able to go in. I mentioned that Caravaggio leaves Naples. He thinks that he's going to be pardoned. I know you're not going to believe this, but he gets into an altercation and he goes to jail. And he escapes jail and he gets on a horse and he's about 20 miles from Rome. And he dies. He dies, as his first biographer said, he died as miserably as he had lived. And recently, they have done some DNA testing on bones that were thought to be Caravaggio's. They've determined that they probably are. What did he die of? Was it lead poisoning from all the paint? Was it trauma still from the fight at the tavern? Was it heat stroke, exhaustion? Who knows? He was 38 years old when he died. This is his death warrant right here. From 1609. So he dies down actually in Tuscany, and one of the most beautiful parts of Tuscany called Porto Ercole or Monte Argentario. So his death was as dramatic, certainly, as his life. I think I've gone over a little bit here. So yes, I have 10 minutes over. I'm going to stop sharing and then, let's see, stop sharing. I have to turn this off. Let's see, laser pointer, there we go. Stop share.